25. Gospel legends that vanished without a trace. What if I told you that some of gospel's brightest stars' voices that once shook churches, filled stadiums, and even inspired rock and roll vanished without a trace? One was buried in an unmarked grave. Another walked away from fame and never explained why. These were pioneers, prophets, and powerhouses, yet their names are whispered today if remembered at all. Why were they forgotten, and what secrets hide behind their disappearances? Stay tuned as we uncover 25 gospel legends who slipped into silence. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence, because their stories deserve to be heard. Reverend James Cleveland, I respect you. Reverend James Cleveland stands as one of the towering pillars of gospel music, a man whose influence stretched far beyond the pulpit and choir stand. Born in 1931 on the south side of Chicago, he grew up immersed in the sound of church choirs and spiritual hymns. Under the mentorship of Thomas A. Dorsey, Cleveland learned not only the art of gospel composition, but also the power of connecting music with faith. His gravelly, unpolished voice defied expectations at a time when smooth tones were celebrated, yet it became his greatest strength. Audiences felt every lyric, as if the heavens themselves were speaking through him. In the 1950s and 60s, Cleveland's collaborations with legendary figures, such as Aretha Franklin and the Caravans, elevated his profile, but his true legacy was cemented when he founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America in 1968. This annual gathering united thousands of singers, musicians, and composers, giving them a platform to refine their gifts and spread gospel music worldwide. His visionary leadership transformed the choir into a powerful force in worship, creating anthems that still echo in churches today. But behind his monumental achievements lay complicated truths. After his death in 1991, controversies erupted regarding his personal life and finances, sparking lawsuits and uneasy questions within the gospel community. While those disputes lingered, they could never erase the fact that Cleveland's music reshaped the sound of worship and gave countless artists the chance to rise. Have you ever wondered whether the weight of scandal unfairly dims a person's legacy, or should the music itself be the ultimate testimony? Reverend James Cleveland may no longer stand at the microphone, but his arrangements, choirs, and groundbreaking vision ensure that his spirit still reverberates every Sunday morning. His voice, though silenced, remains unforgettable. Danny Bell Hall. Danny Bell Hall was never the kind of singer who chased the spotlight, yet her voice had the power to still a room. Born in Pittsburgh in 1938, she grew up with a deep devotion to her faith, and that devotion poured through every note she sang. Her sound was gentle but firm, soft, but unshakably confident. She had the rare gift of making worship feel personal, as though she were singing directly to your heart. Her breakthrough came in the 1970s when she joined Andraé Crouch and the Disciples, a group that reshaped contemporary gospel. Standing alongside one of gospel's most innovative leaders, she quickly distinguished herself with a tone that was both intimate and commanding. Soon after, she launched her solo career, releasing beloved albums such as This Moment and He Is King. But it was her timeless song, Ordinary People, that became her anthem. That ballad, with its simple yet profound message, continues to move congregations decades later. What made Danny Bell even more remarkable was her openness about life's trials. She spoke candidly about surviving breast cancer at a time when such personal battles were rarely shared in public. Her honesty allowed listeners to see not just the singer, but the woman of faith who lived what she sang. Have you ever heard a song so honest that it felt like someone had lived your story before you even told it? By the late 1980s, her name appeared less in the headlines, and many wondered why her music no longer played on radio the way it once did. Yet her absence from the spotlight never erased her presence in people's lives. When she passed in 2000, the news came quietly, leaving many fans heartbroken. Even today, her voice remains a gentle reminder that gospel is at its most powerful when it comes from the soul. Keith Pringle. Yes, Keith Pringle was a burst of energy in the gospel world, a man whose music carried the fire of the church, but also the pulse of the streets. Born in 1950, he was mentored by the great Reverend James Cleveland, but he quickly carved his own lane with a style that felt vibrant, youthful, and refreshing. Unlike many of his peers who leaned into traditional arrangements, Pringle brought a lively, almost funky edge that gave gospel a new groove. In the 1980s, his songs like Call Him Up and Perfect Peace became staples across black churches in America. His voice, smooth yet commanding, could soar into falsetto with ease, then drop into warm, soulful tones that wrapped listeners in reassurance. Beyond singing, Pringle was a visionary. He founded the Pentecostal Community Choir, or PCC, which gave gospel choirs a new, exciting sound and inspired future generations of worship leaders. He even stepped into radio, especially on the West Coast, helping push gospel to a younger audience who might not have engaged otherwise. Have you ever wondered why some artists step away from success at their peak, leaving fans with more questions than answers? By the late 1980s, Keith Pringle's public presence began to fade. Unlike others whose departures were marked by scandal, his withdrawal was quiet. Some believed he chose to focus on ministry, while others thought he simply needed rest from the relentless demands of the industry. When he passed away in 1997, the gospel community was shocked. Many had not realized just how far he had stepped from the spotlight. Though his name may not be as widely spoken today, his influence lingers every time a gospel choir lifts its voice with spirited energy. Keith Pringle may have vanished too soon, but the echoes of his music remain. Darrell Coley. Darrell Coley was the kind of singer whose voice could stop you in your tracks. Born in Berkeley, California in 1955, he grew up surrounded by music, learning early that his gift was something extraordinary. Unlike many vocalists, Coley could do it all, soaring to operatic highs, sliding into velvety lows, and infusing each phrase with emotion that felt raw and unfiltered. When he sang, it wasn't performance, it was revelation. His career began humbly singing background for gospel icons like Edwin Hawkins and Tremaine Hawkins, but it didn't take long before his own brilliance demanded the spotlight. His debut solo project, Just Darrell, 1986, announced him as a major voice in contemporary gospel. Then came He's Preparing Me, a song that remains a classic, blending jazz-infused arrangements with gospel conviction. Coley made gospel music elegant yet accessible, proving that innovation could exist without sacrificing the spiritual message. But life tested him in ways even his voice couldn't always overcome. In the 1990s, Coley was diagnosed with diabetes, which brought devastating complications, including temporary blindness. As his health declined, his public appearances became rare, and fans who once felt lifted by his music suddenly realized they hadn't heard from him in years. Have you ever felt the ache of realizing one of your favorite voices disappeared before you even noticed they were gone? Despite his health struggles, Coley never lost his faith, and his few later performances carried even deeper resonance. When he passed away in 2016 at just 60 years old, the gospel world mourned not only a great loss, but also the silence that had preceded it. Today, his recordings remind us that gospel at its best is not about perfection, it's about touching the soul. And Darrell Coley did that every time. LaShun Pace. LaShun Pace was a force of nature in gospel music, a singer whose voice could shake the rafters of any church and pierce straight to the soul. Born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1961, she was one of the famed Anointed Pace Sisters, a family group that brought raw, spirit-filled energy to every performance. Even in a group of powerful voices, LaShun stood out. Her vocal strength was unmatched, deep, commanding, and overflowing with conviction. Her solo career quickly confirmed her star power. Songs like I Know I've Been Changed became church anthems sung at countless services as reminders of faith and resilience. Decades later, her single Act Like You Know unexpectedly went viral on social media, introducing her powerhouse voice to a new generation. What made her unforgettable wasn't just her ability to hit notes few others could. It was the way she made you feel every word, as though it were your own testimony. But behind her extraordinary gift was a life marked by heartbreak and struggle. And LaShawn battled serious health problems, including an enlarged heart that made performing increasingly difficult. She also endured the devastating loss of her daughter Xenia, a tragedy that left an indelible scar on her spirit. Have you ever heard a voice so powerful that you could almost feel the pain and triumph of a lifetime inside one note? Though she continued to make appearances and record fans noticed her presence was less consistent in her later years. When she passed away in March 2022, the gospel community was shaken to its core. Tributes poured in not just for her music, but for the life she lived openly and authentically through joy and through sorrow. LaShawn Pace may be gone, but her voice remains a reminder of gospel's ability to carry both grief and hope in the same breath. Inez Andrews. Inez Andrews earned the title High Priestess of Gospel, and once you hear her sing, you understand why. Born in 1929 in Birmingham, Alabama, she rose to fame as a member of the legendary Caravans, one of the most influential gospel groups in history. Standing alongside icons like Albertina Walker and Shirley Caesar, Andrews carved her place with a voice that was both commanding and deeply spiritual. Her sound carried authority when she sang. It felt less like a performance and more like a sermon set to music. Her rendition of Mary, Don't You Weep remains one of gospel's most celebrated performances, powerful enough to move listeners to tears decades later. But Andrews wasn't only a singer, she was also a gifted songwriter, penning many of the songs that fueled her ministry and made the Caravans unforgettable. This dual talent set her apart in a time when women were rarely given space to shine as both vocalists and composers. As gospel evolved through the 1970s and 1980s, new styles and artists began dominating the spotlight. Andrews never abandoned her roots in traditional gospel, but it also meant she wasn't featured on television or award shows as often as her contemporaries. For younger generations, her name slowly faded into the background, even though her influence remained in the DNA of gospel music. Have you ever noticed how the architects of a genre are sometimes the very ones history forgets? The fastest Inez Andrews continued performing at smaller events and serving her community, holding fast to the message of her music. When she passed away in December 2012 at the age of 83, those who truly knew gospel recognized that one of the greatest voices had been silenced. Though her name may not trend, her impact echoes through every gospel singer who dares to sing with boldness and truth. Willie Neal Johnson. Willie Neal Johnson was the kind of gospel singer who could electrify a congregation with a single note. Born in 1935 in Tyler, Texas, he became best known as the frontman of the Gospel Keynotes, later renamed Willie Neal Johnson and the New Keynotes. His gritty, heartfelt vocals carried the raw essence of traditional gospel, and when he sang, you didn't just hear the music, you felt it deep in your spirit. With songs like Jesus, You've Been Good to Me, Be Right, and I'll Do What You Want Me to Do, Johnson turned every performance into a revival service. His voice was not polished in a commercial sense, but that was the beauty of it. It was drenched in sincerity. He didn't rely on theatrics. His power came from authenticity, from pouring every ounce of himself into the music. For many, his sound became the soundtrack of Sunday mornings, especially in small-town churches across the South. Why do you think certain voices, though once beloved, fade from public memory faster than others? Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Willie Neal Johnson built a loyal following, and the Gospel Keynotes became one of the most respected quartet groups in gospel history. His live shows were intense, filled with shouting, clapping, and tears, as if each concert doubled as both worship and testimony. Yet when he passed away in January 2001, gospel music lost more than just a singer, it lost a spark. Without his fiery presence, the group struggled to maintain the same energy, and over time, fewer younger fans recognized his name. Still, his influence lingers quietly. Groups like Lee Williams and the Spiritual QCs carry echoes of his style, proving that Willie Neal Johnson's spirit lives on. He may have slipped from mainstream recognition, but for those who experienced his voice firsthand, he remains unforgettable. Tim Green. Tim Green's story is one of quiet dedication. A man who gave his entire life to gospel music, not for fame, but for the love of ministry. Born in North Carolina, he grew up in a family steeped in faith and song. Together with his siblings, he formed the Greens, a Southern gospel group that became known for heartfelt harmonies and songs that carried deep spiritual weight. Tim's voice was tender, almost conversational, drawing listeners in, as if he were telling them a personal story through every lyric. Songs like Glory Land, When I Knelt the Blood Fell and Christ is Born became staples in the Southern gospel community. But beyond singing, Tim was a prolific writer and producer, penning hundreds of songs not just for the Greens, but for countless other artists who might never have found their footing without his help. He was the kind of musician who didn't crave the front of the stage. He wanted to build others up, ensuring gospel music's message reached as many hearts as possible. Do you think gospel's unsung heroes, those who work behind the scenes, deserve more recognition than history often gives them? Sadly, Tim's journey was cut short. In the early 2000s, he developed serious health problems that forced him to step back from performing. Unlike stars who left with dramatic announcements, Tim quietly faded from view, and many fans didn't even realize he was gravely ill. When news broke of his passing in 2004, it shocked those who had been touched by his music. His death left a hole not only in the Greens, but also in the broader gospel community. Though his name doesn't dominate history books, Tim Green's fingerprints remain all over gospel music. Every choir or singer who ever performed one of his songs unknowingly carries his legacy forward. Vanessa Bell Armstrong. Vanessa Bell Armstrong's voice was thunder wrapped in velvet, a blend of raw gospel fire with the polish of soul. Born in Detroit in 1953, she rose to prominence in the late 1970s and 1980s, quickly becoming one of gospel's most recognizable female vocalists. Her breakthrough came with the song Peace Be Still, a track that showcased her astonishing vocal range and cemented her as a powerhouse. The way she could soar into high notes and then slide back into a husky, soulful tone made her performances unforgettable. Armstrong was one of the few gospel singers who successfully bridged the gap between sacred and contemporary. Working closely with Thomas Whitfield, she brought a fresh sound that blended gospel authenticity with R&B influence. Albums like Chosen and Wonderful One turned her into a household name within gospel circles, and her fame stretched beyond the church when she performed the theme song for the sitcom Amen. She even shared stages with legends like Whitney Houston and Aretha Franklin, proving her voice belonged in any arena. Have you ever noticed how some artists can make you feel like they're testifying directly to your life story, even if you've never met them? Despite her success, Vanessa's journey was not without hardship. In the 2000s, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a debilitating disease that affected her ability to tour and perform. Around the same time, she lost her husband, tragedies that left her physically and emotionally drained. The once constant presence in gospel nearly vanished from the public eye with only occasional appearances, reminding fans of the fire she once carried so boldly. Still, Vanessa Bell Armstrong remains a beloved figure. Though quieter now, her music continues to inspire resilience, reminding us that even when life breaks the body, the spirit can still sing. Joe Ligon was a thunderstorm in human form. His voice could rattle the walls of a church and stir the deepest emotions of the soul. Born in 1936 in Alabama, he grew up singing in the cotton fields before finding his true calling in gospel. In the 1950s, he became the fiery frontman of the Mighty Clouds of Joy, a group that changed the entire landscape of gospel music. They didn't stand stiff in suits like the quartets of old. No, they brought movement, energy, and rhythm. Guitars, drums, and choreography turned their performances into spiritual revivals that felt like a gospel version of the Temptations. Ligon's gritty powerhouse voice anchored the group's biggest hits, including Mighty High H and Just a Little Talk with Jesus. His delivery wasn't about technical polish, it was about conviction. When he sang, people felt every word as a testimony of survival and faith. The mighty clouds of joy went where few gospel acts had gone before performing on Soul Train, and earning Grammy Awards proving gospel music could stand shoulder to shoulder with mainstream acts. Have you ever experienced a singer who seemed to pull every ounce of pain, joy, and triumph from their lungs and hand it directly to you? Even as gospel styles evolved in the 1980s and 1990s, Ligon remained the group's heart, keeping their music rooted in tradition while still appealing to new audiences. But when he passed away in December 2016, it was as if the very soul of the group was extinguished. The mighty clouds tried to carry on, but without Ligon's thunderous voice, the spark was never the same. Though younger generations may not immediately know his name, Joe Ligon's influence lives on every time gospel dares to be bold, loud, and unapologetically soulful. He didn't just sing songs, he made them roar. Frank Williams. Frank Williams may not have had the loudest voice in gospel, but he possessed something just as powerful: vision. Born in 1947 in Smithdale, Mississippi, he began singing with his family group, the Jackson Southernaires, where his smooth baritone and steady presence earned him respect. Yet his greatest contribution came later when he created one of the most enduring institutions in gospel, the Mississippi Mass Choir. In 1988, Williams pulled together singers from across the state with one dream to form a choir that reflected both the heart of Mississippi and the soul of gospel music. Their debut album, Live at Jackson State University, stunned the industry. It sat at #1 on Billboard's gospel charts for 45 consecutive weeks, an unprecedented achievement that proved gospel choirs could achieve commercial success without losing spiritual depth. Under Williams' direction, the choir delivered songs like Near the Cross and I'll See You in the Rapture, turning Sunday morning worship into something that echoed across the world. Can you imagine the courage it takes to step out of the shadows of a family group and build something entirely new, leaving behind a legacy larger than yourself? Despite his growing influence, Frank Williams remained a humble leader. He wasn't a showman chasing fame, he was a shepherd, guiding voices into harmony. His calm spirit balanced the fiery energy of the choir, creating a sound that moved both church congregations and global audiences. But in March 1993, tragedy struck when Williams died suddenly at just 45 years old. The news devastated the gospel community, especially since few knew he had been battling health issues. Though the Mississippi Mass Choir continues to sing today, its foundation was laid by Frank Williams's vision and faith. His time was short, but his impact was timeless. A reminder that leadership in gospel is not always about standing in front, but about lifting others higher. Margaret Allison. Margaret Allison's name may not be shouted as often today, but in her time she broke barriers that few women in gospel dared to cross. Born in 1921 in McCormick, South Carolina, she carried a quiet strength that would one day reshape the gospel stage. In 1944, when most successful groups were led by men, Margaret founded the Angelic Gospel Singers, an all-female ensemble that proved women could lead and dominate in the gospel world. Their sound was pure, traditional gospel-rich harmonies, heartfelt delivery, and songs that touched the very soul. Their breakout hit, Touch Me Lord Jesus, You Sold. Have you ever noticed how the trailblazers, the ones who open doors for others, are often the very ones history forgets first? As gospel evolved into flashier styles in the 1970s and 1980s, Allison and her group never bent to trends. They stayed true to their roots, which earned them loyalty, but also kept them out of the spotlight as the industry shifted. Younger audiences swept up in contemporary gospel often overlooked the pioneers who laid the foundation. By the time Margaret passed away in 2008, the Angelic Gospel Singers had faded into quiet memory for many, even though their music had once carried churches into worship across the nation. Cleophas Robinson. Cleophas Robinson, often called the minister of music, carried gospel with a preacher's conviction and a singer's fire. Born in 1932 in Mississippi, Robinson grew up deeply rooted in church life, where his deep, resonant voice became both his gift and his calling. He wasn't just a singer, he was a pastor, a broadcaster, and a television personality who used every platform available to spread gospel music far and wide. By the 1960s, Robinson's ministry extended beyond the pulpit. His recordings with Peacock Records gave gospel fans classics like Wrapped Up, Tied Up, Tangled Up, and Praise, The Cleophas Robinson Show to Ghosts. Have you ever thought about how many pioneers brought gospel to mass audiences long before streaming and social media made music accessible to all? Despite his impact, Robinson's popularity began to wane in the 1980s and 1990s. As contemporary gospel and new worship styles gained traction, his traditional sound was labeled old-fashioned by younger listeners. Yet Robinson never strayed from his roots. His focus was ministry, not trends. When he passed away in 1998, many in the broader public didn't realize just how much he had given to gospel, both as a performer and as a mentor. Though not always mentioned in modern gospel conversations, Cleophas Robinson's legacy is undeniable. He bridged the worlds of preaching, singing, and broadcasting, ensuring gospel's message was heard far beyond the church walls. Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Long before Elvis shook his hips or Chuck Berry bent a guitar string, Sister Rosetta Tharpe was already blazing the trail. Born in 1915 in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, she grew up performing gospel music with her mother in traveling evangelistic shows. But it was when she strapped on an electric guitar and merged church hymns with blistering riffs that music history quietly changed forever. With hits like Strange Things happening every day, Rosetta became one of the first artists to blend gospel fervor with the rebellious energy that would later define rock and roll. Her performances were unlike anything audiences had seen. She would walk onto the stage in church clothes, guitar slung over her shoulder, and deliver music that was both holy and electrifying. She toured internationally, inspiring countless musicians who would later be hailed as pioneers, including Johnny Cash, Little Richard, and Elvis Presley. Yet while they found fame and recognition, Rosetta was often left in the shadows, dismissed as too worldly by some in the church and too gospel by the rock industry. Have you ever wondered how many women shaped entire genres only to have their contributions erased until decades later? By the time she passed away in 1973, Rosetta's health had declined. She lost a leg to diabetes and was buried in an unmarked grave. For someone who had given so much, it was a heartbreaking end. It wasn't until 2018 that she was finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a recognition that came far too late. Sister Rosetta Tharpe may not have lived to see her rightful crown, but today she is remembered as the godmother of rock and roll. Her boldness and brilliance remind us that gospel has always had the power to shake the world. Brother Joe May. Brother Joe May was once hailed as the thunderbolt of the Midwest, and the title fit him perfectly. Born in 1912 in Macon, Mississippi, he carried a voice so forceful and commanding that he could fill a room without the aid of a microphone. His singing wasn't just loud, it was layered with emotion, conviction, and raw spiritual energy that left congregations trembling. When he opened his mouth to sing, it was as though a storm had rolled into the church, shaking hearts and lifting souls. His breakthrough came with Cirque, a song that became his signature. Every performance of it felt less like entertainment and more like a plea straight from heaven. Joe May was discovered by Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who recognized his rare gift and took him on tour. That partnership not only expanded his audience but also placed him on the roster of Specialty Records, one of gospel's most important labels in the 1940s and 1950s. His records sold impressively in the gospel market, making him a household name among believers who craved the intensity he brought. Have you ever heard a singer whose voice seemed to embody both judgment and mercy at the same time? Unlike some of his peers, Joe May resisted crossing over into secular music, even though it might have brought him mainstream fame. He stayed rooted in gospel, loyal to the tradition that had shaped him. But as trends shifted in the 1960s and younger, flashier artists emerged, his name slowly slipped from the spotlight. When he passed away in 1972, many younger fans didn't even realize he was still performing. Brother Joe may not be remembered by all, but for those who heard him, his voice was unforgettable. A thunderbolt that once shook gospel to its core. Reverend Milton Brunson. Reverend Milton Brunson was not the flashiest name in gospel, but his influence was undeniable. Born in 1929 in Chicago, Illinois, Brunson had a gift for shaping choirs into instruments of power and praise. While solo stars often grabbed the headlines, he worked quietly, yet effectively, building one of the most respected ensembles in gospel history, the Thompson Community, singers affectionately known as the Tommies. Under Brunson's leadership, the Tommies became a national force. Their repertoire included unforgettable classics like "Available to You, There Is No Failure in God, and It's Gonna Be All Right." These weren't just songs, they were declarations of faith that carried believers through hard times. Brunson's genius lay in his ability to blend the depth of traditional gospel with fresh, modern arrangements that made choirs feel alive and contemporary without losing their sacred core. Through his direction, the Tommies became a training ground, launching the careers of future gospel luminaries such as Ricky Dillard, Darius Brooks, and Jesse Dixon. Isn't it fascinating how some of the greatest leaders stay in the background, quietly shaping voices that will outshine their own? Though his name wasn't always in lights, Brunson's commitment to excellence earned him national recognition, including a Grammy Award in 1995 for Through God's Eyes. But his story, like many gospel legends, came to a bittersweet end. Reverend Brunson passed away in 1997, and without his steady hand, the Tommies gradually slowed down. The gospel industry itself was shifting, with choirs losing popularity as solo artists and praise and worship music took center stage. Yet his impact remains. Every time a choir raises its voice in unison, they echo the standard he set. Reverend Milton Brunson may not have chased fame, but his work left a permanent mark on gospel, proving that true greatness often lives in the harmony of others. Clara Ward. Clara Ward was more than a gospel singer. She was a trailblazer who brought sophistication and showmanship to a genre often confined within church walls. Born in 1924 in Philadelphia, she grew up under the guidance of her mother, Gertrude Ward, and together they formed the famous Ward Singers. At a time when gospel music was mostly traditional and restrained, Clara dared to make it vibrant, stylish, and polished, captivating audiences, not only in America, but also across Europe. Her voice was strong, clear, and commanding, but what made her stand out was her presence. She didn't just sing hymns, she performed them. Dressed in elegant gowns, Clara led the Ward Singers with confidence, offering audiences a gospel experience that felt larger than life. Their recordings and performances in the 1940s and 1950s inspired countless singers, including Aretha Franklin and Patti LaBelle, who later credited Clara as a major influence. But her boldness wasn't without backlash. Many in the gospel community criticized her for taking the music into nightclubs and theaters, accusing her of making gospel too worldly. Clara, however, insisted that gospel was for everyone, no matter where it was sung. Do you think pushing gospel beyond church walls helped preserve it? Or did it risk watering down its sacred power? Despite her groundbreaking work, Clara's later years were marked by health struggles and financial challenges. She suffered multiple strokes and passed away in 1973 at only 48 years old, leaving fans mourning the loss of one of gospel's most charismatic pioneers. Though often overshadowed in modern discussions of gospel history, Clara Ward's daring approach helped redefine what gospel could be. She broke barriers, influenced legends, and proved that worship music could be as dazzling as it was spiritual. Her voice and vision still echo through every artist who blends faith with fearless performance. Thomas Whitfield. Thomas Whitfield was known as the maestro of gospel, and the title could not have been more fitting. Born in Detroit in 1954, Whitfield was a prodigy whose gifts extended far beyond singing. He was a pianist, composer, arranger, and choir director whose creative touch shaped the sound of modern gospel. While many artists thrived as performers, Whitfield thrived as a builder, constructing lush harmonies, intricate arrangements, and unforgettable melodies that carried gospel into a new era. With his group, the Whitfield Company, he created classics like Hallelujah, I Shall Wear a Crown, A.H. His sound was distinctive, rich, orchestral, and sophisticated, blending the soul of gospel with the technical brilliance of classical music. That innovation gave gospel choirs a new voice and inspired singers like Vanessa Bell Armstrong and Yolanda Adams, both of whom rose under his mentorship and guidance. Isn't it amazing how some of the most influential names in music are the ones who preferred to stand behind others, crafting brilliance from the shadows? Despite his enormous talent, Whitfield often worked quietly in the background, arranging for others and pushing them to shine. Yet his work earned respect far and wide. He became a benchmark for excellence in gospel music, admired not only for his genius, but also for his humility. Sadly, his life was cut tragically short. In 1992, at just 38 years old, he died of a heart attack while still in the prime of his creativity. Though he never reached the mainstream fame of some peers, Thomas Whitfield's fingerprints remain on gospel to this day. His arrangements continue to be sung in choirs across the world, and his influence lives on every time a gospel song dares to sound grander, deeper, and more profound. Whitfield proved that gospel was not just music, it was an art form worthy of the highest respect. Jobia Jeter. Jobia Jeter had the kind of voice that seemed destined for greatness, a warm, soulful tone that could glide effortlessly between tenderness and power. Born in South Carolina, she was raised in the tradition of gospel music, where her natural gift quickly set her apart. In the early 1980s, she captured attention with her moving performances, her sound embodying both youthful promise and spiritual depth. Unlike many singers who leaned heavily on power alone, Jeter's voice carried nuance. Every phrase felt carefully painted with emotion. Her transition into R&B seemed like the next logical step. Signing with Elektra Records, she released tracks such as All of My Love, showcasing her ability to straddle the line between gospel sincerity and mainstream polish. Audiences who heard her alongside her husband, R&B vocalist Glenn Jones, believed the two were on the cusp of becoming a powerhouse couple in music. Together they embodied both artistry and chemistry, and their voices blended seamlessly on stage and in recordings. Have you ever watched a rising star and thought they were destined for longevity, only to wonder later why their light disappeared so suddenly? For reasons never fully explained. Jobia's solo career never soared as expected. There were no public scandals, no dramatic fallouts. She simply receded from the spotlight. Some speculated she chose to focus on family life, while others believed the demands of the industry took too heavy a toll. By the late 1980s, her name rarely appeared in music headlines, leaving fans with more questions than answers. Though her career seemed to vanish quietly, those who remember Jobia Jeter know her voice left a lasting impression. Her story remains one of gospel and R&B's lingering mysteries, a reminder that sometimes even the brightest flames are extinguished before the world realizes how brightly they burned. Dolores Honey Sykes. Dolores H. Dolores Honey Sykes is perhaps one of gospel's greatest mysteries. Born into the legendary Clark family, she was, right there at the beginning, an original member of the Clark Sisters, the group that would eventually change gospel music forever. Trained under their mother, the formidable Dr. Mattie Moss Clark, Honey grew up surrounded by faith and discipline, learning the same harmonies and vocal techniques that shaped her sisters, Twinkie, Karen, Dorinda, and Jackie, into icons. For a brief moment, she stood on stage with them, her voice blending into what would become one of the most important gospel sounds of all time. And then, she walked away. In the early 1970s, just before the Clark sisters exploded with hits like You Brought the Sunshine. Doesn't it make you wonder what inner battles could drive someone to leave just before history was made? Unlike her sisters, Honey never pursued a solo career, never recorded her own projects, and never returned for high-profile reunions. Even when the Clark sisters were celebrated in the Lifetime biopic, her presence was little more than a whisper, leaving fans questioning why her story seemed erased. Over time, Honey faded completely from the public eye, becoming gospel's unanswered question. Though she may have stepped away from the spotlight, Dolores Honey Sykes remains a vital part of gospel history. Without her voice in those early days, the foundation of the Clark sisters would not be the same. Her absence is a reminder that sometimes the most intriguing legacies are built not on what we know, but on the mysteries we never solve. Myrna Summers. Myrna Summers is one of those gospel legends whose name may not dominate mainstream conversations, yet her voice and leadership reshaped the sound of the Black church in the 1980s and 1990s. Born in 1949 in Washington, D.C., she carried a deep, soul-stirring tone that made every song feel like a sermon. Unlike singers who chased the spotlight, Summers focused on the ministry of music, pouring fire and conviction into every choir she directed. Her career soared with unforgettable hits like "God Gave Me a Song, Give Me Something to Hold On To," and "So Much to Be Grateful For." These weren't just popular tracks, they were anthems of hope sung in churches nationwide. Summers' delivery was powerful yet deeply personal, as though she was standing in the very struggle her lyrics described. Her work earned her Grammy and Stellar Awards, cementing her place among the greats. Have you ever heard a choir so powerful that it felt like the walls of the church themselves might collapse under the weight of the Spirit? Summers was also a pioneering choir leader, helping shape the massive emotional sound that defined gospel in the late 20th century. Under her baton, choirs didn't just sing, they testified. But as gospel shifted in the 2000s towards solo stars and contemporary praise and worship styles, Summers gradually stepped back from the public spotlight. She never vanished entirely, though. Instead, she continued to serve faithfully as minister of music at Reed Temple AME Church in Maryland, mentoring new generations and keeping gospel rooted in its traditional power. Though quieter now, her influence lingers. Every time a choir swells with unshakable passion, Myrna Summers' legacy is present. She reminds us that true gospel power isn't about fame, it's about transforming lives through song. Reverend Paul S. Morton Sr. Reverend Paul S. Morton Sr. is a name that resonates not only in gospel music, but also in church leadership. Born in 1950 in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, and raised in Detroit, Michigan, he would grow into one of the most influential pastors and singers of his generation. Morton's ministry was never confined to a pulpit. His gift was merging the power of preaching with the emotional resonance of music. In the early 1990s, he made history by founding the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship, a movement that combined the structure of the Baptist tradition with the spirit and energy of Pentecostal worship. It swept across the nation, changing the way thousands of churches approached praise, prayer, and music. While his sermons inspired congregations, Morton's music amplified his reach. Songs like "Let It Rain, Bow Down, and Worship Him in Your Best Days" yet became staples in worship services, blending gentle sincerity with powerful prayer. His ability to sing, as if he were speaking directly to God, left listeners with a sense of intimacy rarely found in public worship. Have you ever felt a song so prayerful that it seemed less like music and more like a direct conversation with heaven? Though his voice touched millions, Morton eventually began stepping back from the spotlight. In the late 2010s, he announced his retirement from full-time pastoral duties, focusing instead on mentoring younger leaders and supporting the next generation of ministers. Meanwhile, his son P.J. Morton carved his own path as a Grammy-winning R&B and soul artist, proving that music was deeply woven into the Morton family's legacy. James Moore. James Moore was a singer who could move an audience from tears to triumph in a single verse. Born in 1956 in Detroit, Michigan, he was blessed with a voice that combined immense power with piercing vulnerability. Moore rose to fame in the late 1980s and 1990s, captivating gospel listeners with songs like "Yes, Lord, Live" so God can use you, and he was there all the time. With these, unlike some singers whose voices were admired for their technical brilliance alone, Moore's gift lay in his sincerity. You could hear in his tone that he had endured trials, and he used his voice as both a cry and a declaration of hope. Fans often said that listening to him felt like hearing a sermon wrapped in song. Have you ever heard someone sing in such a way that you felt they were telling your own story of pain and perseverance? Sadly, James Moore's journey was marked by devastating health struggles. Diagnosed with diabetes, he endured complications so severe that he eventually lost both of his legs. At the height of his career, when he should have been commanding stages, he was instead forced to step back from public life. Seeking better medical care, he moved to Europe and recorded a handful of projects there, but his presence in gospel circles diminished. In 2000, at just 44 years old, James Moore passed away, leaving behind a grieving community and a legacy that still resonates. Though his time was brief, James Moore remains one of gospel's most unforgettable voices. Proof that even in suffering, a song can carry hope strong enough to outlive the singer. Edna Gallman Cook. Edna Gallman Cook was one of gospel's earliest superstars, a woman whose voice carried both sweetness and conviction in equal measure. Born in Columbia, South Carolina in 1917, she was the daughter of a Baptist minister, and it was in the church that her extraordinary soprano first drew attention. By the 1940s, she had become a national sensation, her pure, high-pitched vocals cutting through choirs and captivating audiences in ways that few singers of her era could. Songs like Stop Gambler, Walk Through the Valley, and Heaven Is My View turned Cook into a household name among black churchgoers. Her performances weren't just about singing notes, they were about telling stories. She had a unique way of dramatizing lyrics, making every line feel urgent and alive, as if she were pulling listeners into a sacred narrative. Crowds would pack churches and auditoriums just to feel the Spirit move through her voice. Isn't it striking how some artists, even without modern technology or media, managed to build legacies that filled entire communities with hope and faith? Cook toured tirelessly across the South and Midwest during the 1940s and 1950s, laying groundwork for the gospel industry long before it became commercially recognized. Yet her career never reached the preservation stage many of her peers enjoyed. Much of her music was not reissued in later decades, leaving younger generations unaware of her immense contributions. Tragedy struck in 1967 when she passed away suddenly at the age of just 50, cutting short a career that had already influenced countless gospel artists. Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia Jackson wasn't just a gospel singer, she was the voice of a movement. Born in 1911 in New Orleans, Louisiana, she grew up in poverty, singing in the church while cleaning homes to help her family survive. Her deep, powerful contralto soon became her gift to the world. By the 1930s, Mahalia's voice was transforming storefront churches into holy sanctuaries, and by the 1940s, she was recording songs that would change gospel music forever. Her breakthrough came with Move On Up a Little Higher in 1947, which sold more than 1 million copies, an unheard-of feat for gospel at the time. Hits like Facing and How I Got Over cemented her as the queen of gospel. But Mahalia's legacy reached far beyond the church pews. She became the voice of the civil rights movement, singing at rallies, marches, and even at the 1963 March on Washington, where she stood alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech, it was Mahalia who urged him moments before. Tell them about the dream, Martin. Have you ever heard a voice so commanding that it felt like both a prayer and a battle cry for justice? Despite international fame, Mahalia never strayed from her gospel roots. She performed at Carnegie Hall, toured globally, and sold millions of records, yet refused to sing secular music even when pressured by the industry. In 1972, she passed away at age 60, leaving behind a world that had been forever changed by her voice. Though today's younger audiences may not always know her name, Mahalia Jackson's influence is everywhere from church choirs to civil rights history. She proved gospel wasn't just music for Sunday mornings, it was a force that could shake nations and heal broken spirits. Behind every hymn, every choir, and every powerful solo stood men and women who gave everything to gospel. Yet many of their names have faded from memory. From Mahalia Jackson's thunderous cry for justice to Dolores Honey Sykes' mysterious disappearance, their stories remind us that greatness is often fragile. But here's the question. Do we, the listeners, carry some responsibility for allowing these legends to vanish without a trace? Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more untold stories, and join us on Legends of Black Excellence, where history still sings.